This title, Buried Objects, you have to say takes a little bit of courage, to come to a school of archaeology as a non-archaeologist and say, I'm going to give you a talk about buried objects, because you have all the authority and certainly the right to say, well, we do buried objects, what might you know about them? I thought of it in terms of the Greek proverb, Ela papu nasu dixota ambeliasum, which is where I feel like I might be. This opening picture is a picture of a buried object. Not all of the silver-plated and gold-plated bit, but that square icon in the middle, which is an engraved icon in the medium of wax and mastic, which was dug out of the ground in Naxos. So I've got in mind a different sort of buried object for a start than the ones that you normally deal with at the BSA. This is obviously a Byzantine rather than a classical, archaic, or Bronze Age, or even still earlier prehistoric artifact. The talk today brings us into the area of indigenous archaeology. It will be relevant for you. It's a direction which the discipline of archaeology has gone in. It's also really nice to see friends from the archaeological dig on Poros here, which I was associated with in a distant capacity. But that archaeological dig had accompanying it an anthropological team. Aris Anagmistopoulos is here, Yanis Hamilakis, studied the locals on Poros and what they thought about the site. In other words, what are their what they called a archaeological ethnography, getting a sense of what the local people think about antiquities in their environment. And an element of that is indigenous archaeology. What do they think about the actual objects, not just the site in general and so on, but the actual objects? The local ideas about history and local versions of archaeology, basically. So that's where this talk is headed. This is a local indigenous archaeology of a Christian past, and it's, as such, it's sort of beneath the radar, I think, of general archaeology of the sort done at the school. For many people, it's sort of even, it's beneath the radar, it's beneath the level of serious archaeology, what a local might think about an artifact like that. And for some people, it's even beneath contempt. It just doesn't rate thinking about. This paper takes one episode from Naxos, and it takes it seriously. And what I'm doing this evening is a sort of rumination on the epistemology of indigenous archaeology, and by extension, the epistemology of standard academic archaeology. This is also the direction of anthropology. It's not just about studying the thought systems of others who are definitely other, perhaps even exotically other than us, but the way in which that study can come back and help us to reflect on ourselves. It's not just a one-way street where I give you this phantasmagoria of what other people do, but how in doing that it causes you to rethink your own categories that belong in a similar area. So if we study the indigenous archaeology of villagers on Naxos, implicitly this got to raise questions about the way we do archaeology even at a place like the BSA. So that much I offer at the conceptual and theoretical level. This talk offers problems, perhaps a problem for Greek archaeologists, that is, archaeologists who are of Greek extraction, the Greek-educated public, and the Greek population generally. Which are they? Which are you? Are you indigenous archaeologists, or are you post-Enlightenment scientific archaeologists, or perhaps some combination of those two? Personally, we can debate it. I don't think they're really binary choices. I think that in these situations, people are a bit of each. In addition to raising these epistemological questions, raising them at the theoretical level, this paper also studies an interaction between two modes of archaeology, two modes of historical thought. As you'll see, It studies the interaction between Romaic and Hellenic archaeology in contact, in collision, in conflict. This is a paper about Christian archaeology versus a post-Enlightenment archaeology that would study it or diminish it, and that's all going to become clear presently. Now, this is part of a larger study that I've been working on for quite some time. In fact, it's a book that I have finished it, and the book should be published within the next year. And I'm covering material from one of the chapters of that book. So, incidentally, the title of that chapter is in fact the title of this talk. So I didn't just make it up to come to British School. I was already heading in this direction. I'll have to give you some background, obviously, and I'll do that in a second. But I was heading in this direction. And so it makes me come back to my earlier proverb, whether or not I've stumbled into your ambeli, or whether I found my own ambeli, or that remains to be seen, but it might just be that we're into a Sefrago ambeli. So, the events that I'm going to talk about, I just want to give you a visual coordinate of the beautiful island of Naxos on a cloudy day, much like today. And you notice rising up the high central mountain of Naxos, known as Za. And that gives you a little more of a map. And you can see the characteristic of Naxos is that spine of high mountains in the center. And where I did my first research, was in Apiranthos, right there. And latterly, I've been working in this village called Koronos there. So both Apiranthos and Koronos are on the eastern side of that central spine of mountains. And there's just more of a close-up of the actual area. You can see Apiranthos at the bottom, Koronos at the middle. And I wanted to show you this place, which is marked on the map as Argokiliotisa. That is the site of a big church, a medium-sized church actually for all these years, and the site of the largest pilgrimage, and the only really major pilgrimage on Naxos, a pan-Naxiot pilgrimage. And just to give you a little more visual coordinate, there is the village of Koronos. Just to show you what it looks like. This village has the oversight of the pilgrimage. So something on the order of 5,000 pilgrims come every year to Argokili, there's a picture of Argokili and the church that was consecrated there in 1851. So this is the village's pilgrimage, and it's also the most important pilgrimage on Naxos. What's of interest today are the events that led to the consecration of this church, this 1851 church. And those events, I've got to just summarize them very briefly before I can really start my paper. That various villagers, beginning in 1831, began to have dreams. They began to see dreams, as you say in Greek. And they saw dreams of the Panagia, speaking to them and telling them to dig up her icon, which was buried at this place, Argokili. The icon itself was asking to be discovered. Then, on the day of the Annunciation, on the 25th of March, 1836, 4 icons were discovered. Now, the church, the Greek church, then you were in the newly founded Kingdom of Greece, just after independence. The church was under the Holy Synod. They were not pleased, you might be surprised to learn, by this discovery. Nor was the state, when the church had been nationalized and placed beneath the state as a state institution. For one thing, digging up icons without permission broke the laws about excavation, which you at the school know very well. It broke the newly established, only a few years previously, laws that had been put on the books. And furthermore, the newly nationalized church, under the Bavarians, under Bavarian kind of guidance to a certain degree, really wanted to put a cap on charismatic Orthodox spirituality. So this was a movement that they wanted to shut down. And just to give you the schematics of what I've just said. So, although they found the icons in 1836, the icons were confiscated by the church in order to stop this pilgrimage. And in addition to, as I say, shutting down the charismatic movement, they denied repeated applications by the people to build a church there. And this church that you saw in the previous picture was consecrated only 15 years later. Belatedly, they grudgingly gave them a pilgrimage church. So the icons were lost, but the pilgrimage continued. All their icons were confiscated, but they continued to go to this place every year. Then that icon which I showed you previously had been missing, had been confiscated in 1838. A little girl who was lodging in the port town of Naxos, in Chora, began to have dreams one night in her landlady's in this accommodation that that an icon, one of these original icons, this icon, was in the landlady's iconostasis in her house. And indeed they found it. They took that icon back to the village in a great procession, and this caused a great deal of enthusiasm and a great outbreak of piety and so forth. And 5 other children began to see dreams on a nightly basis then in the year 1930. They read their dreams daily to the village, and they wrote them in notebooks. So part of my study has been, for the larger book, reading these notebooks and studying the notebooks of one of the girls. Her notebook survived. Her name was Marina. Tomorrow I'll be giving a lecture at Diri, which will be more focused on the dreams of 1930 in relation to the Great Depression. And I'll give you just to show you another example of Marina's dream notebooks. And the illustrations are illustrations of signs that appeared in the sky, which she saw in the dreams. And the dreams were saying that there was another further icon, an icon of St. Anne, still buried in the ground at Argokili, and that they needed to dig it up. And they spent a lot of 1930 digging and looking for it. And that should that icon be found, there would be a big reversal of fortune, that everything would go better in the village. There would be a huge economic boom. And the dreams also said that a large church should be built on the spot. I showed you a medium-sized church, but the dream said that there should be a huge church built there. And indeed, the instruction that there should be a church had already been given in the 1830s. So this was by now a century-old tradition that a church should be built. And beginning during the period of my field research, beginning after 1995, they did begin to build this church. I'm just bringing you up to date on the story. So during the whole period of the 10 years that I've been doing field research in Koronos on an off-and-on basis, because I'm generally teaching and not able to just spend continuous time there, the church has gone, it's grown in size, and it's getting close to finished. So you can see how it dwarfs the original church there. So, covered a lot of information. I'll just leave you that summary for a moment. That sets the context, really, for what I want to say now. Foundational miracles, such as those on Naxos or the ones on Tinos, which many of you might have already drawn to mind, it's what happened here isn't so different from what happened on Tinos a few years earlier in the 1820s. These foundational miracles involve prolonged digging and dramatic discoveries culminating in the display of novel artifacts. In their emphasis on material objects, these 2 pilgrimages, Naxos and Tinos, differ from major Catholic pilgrimages like the ones at Lourdes, Knock, Fatima, or Medjugorje. Those pilgrimages were inspired by visions alone. The theophanies did not involve the discovery of any material tokens. Even in Spain, comparable events did not lead to the discovery of new objects. At Limpias in 1919 in Spain, A crucifix that was already in the church was seen to roll its eyes, change complexion and sweat, but no new object came to light. Buried objects incite historicization. A tangible object comes to light, its discovery signifies miracle, but its material existence sooner or later raises questions about possible pasts, thus stimulating historical accounts. This would be the difference between European Catholic and Greek Orthodox miracles. Catholic cases can only be given a history back to the moment of theophany. Antecedent sources lie in the ether of transcendence. The Greek cases, by contrast, begin at an early moment when the objects were first created. Their discovery in the present activates an historical imagination of the land and its former inhabitants. On Naxos and Tinos, the original miracle stories themselves included considerable detail on the excavation and discovery of the icons. This is built into the stories. It's all about digging. The newfound icons signified divine grace for the community and became the focus of veneration. At the same time, these artifacts instigated an abduction, which Alfred Gell has identified at work in the contemplation of artifacts generally. Abduction is a logical operation that infers the antecedents of the object by speculating on questions of provenance and production. So abduction. Don't think about aliens. Think about induction, deduction, abduction. The question is, in these cases, who made them? Who made the object? For whom were they made? How did they come to be here? According to the philosopher Charles Peirce, to whom Alfred Gell traces the idea of abduction, quote, "The abductive suggestion comes to us like a flash. It is an act of insight, although of extremely fallible insight. An abduction, like a hunch, is a rapidly formed working hypothesis about something at hand. At Argo Kili, the idea of buried icons set off an abductive flash that fittingly occurred in a moment of vision when the early visionaries, there was one of them was named Christodoulos in the 1830s. He was having these among the first dreams about the Panagia, and I'll read you a little bit in a moment. Christodoulos had a vision that revealed to him that the icons were the possession of Egyptians who had come to Naxos, who had been persecuted. My source for this information was a local priest at the time named Kores, Father Kores. So in Kores's version of the account, he gives the dialogue, he gives the dream account of the dialogue between Christodoulos and the Panagia. And it's got a few glitches in the characters, but this is what it is. Christodoulos asks the Panagia, "Virgin Mother of God, how did you come to be underneath this immovable mountain? Poor sinner that I am, I cannot comprehend this. No one can believe it. Looking at the rocks here solidly joined together, no one can distinguish any space where you might be located." The Panagia then replies to him, this is all a dream, "A poor and blessed couple from Egypt brought me here, displaying great piety toward me. In a period of disorder and fear, they fled to this place here, building small houses, we lived in them, but then persecuted here, again by the enemy, frightened of falling into the hands of tyrants, we prayed to my one and only Son to cover us over. Then immediately we split the mountain, covering the couple and food enough for 3 days. They lived for 10 days and then gave up their souls into the hands of the living God. And as proof," I found that rather important statement, as proof, "Kidia pistosinsas, begin digging at the spot and you will find the bones of this couple and the child. The bones of their animals, even these, should be preserved together with the sanctified bones." So abductive reasoning appears as a first faltering step, which in this case may be explored through excavation. You get an idea of what the thing is, then you dig and you look for more information, as the Panagia is practically revealing scientific method, giving him instructions. As philosopher Peirce put it, abduction, or the suggestion of an explanatory theory, is inference through an icon. That's Peirce's language. By icon, he means like a general image, an image of a whole situation, a gestalt, if you like. It's inference through an icon and is thus connected with firstness. It's a very preliminary initial thing. And Peirce is well known as a pragmatic philosopher. So you can see that forming abductions is an expedient way to navigate in novel situations. It's a pragmatic philosophical idea. I like it for also for its resonance with sort of more occult kind of abduction, but yes, for that inspired way in which ideas come to us. Ideas often come to us in very sort of inspired, slightly not fully rationalized ways that we can understand. A historicizing logic is produced to comprehend the artifacts. Abduction thus emerges not only as a key concept for the anthropology of art, for Alfred Gell, but also for an anthropology of history. And as Carlo Ginzburg has shown in his study of clues and traces, where he also explains the idea of abduction, how important it is for hunters, for historians, for archaeologists, for looking at traces and trying to figure out what they mean. In the case of Tinos, books about the pilgrimage always discuss, the historicity of that icon. How did it get to be there? They say there was an early church on the site. Earlier buildings were found during the excavations, but knowledge about this is all very vague. Indeed, knowledge may be too grand a term. Detailed excavation records were not kept at this time, and any remains were built over and obscured by the large church that grew up on the spot. So thus accounts about Tinos vary. Scholars assume that the icon could have been, must have belonged to a church on the site, and the church was destroyed at some point by take your pick. It could have been Leo III, an iconoclast. It could have been 10th century Saracen pirates. It could have been later Saracens. And these things seem plausible. I mean, they're all possible. And material discoveries, I just want to make this point, lead to this tangle of traffic, of speculation between supposition and knowable historical factuality. And you can factor in as well traditions that an ancient temple of Dionysus stood on the site before it was converted into a church. And it becomes clear that we are facing an even wider gamut spanning from documentable knowledge through plausible inference to unsupported fantasy. I want to just take a moment to consider the matter of buried icons at this point in Greek history, from a broader perspective for a second. Tangible relics and icons have been part of Eastern Christian religiosity since late antiquity, when people began to collect pieces of the true cross or relics of martyrs. During the period of iconoclasm, in about the 8th and early 9th centuries, when the Orthodox Church momentarily opposed figural representation on icons, stories of icons hidden in caves or thrown into the sea, either by those protecting them or those seeking to destroy them, proliferated. Such traditions were revitalized when Christian icons again came under threat in the 15th century, when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. Oral traditions throughout Greece told of icons that could fly, could withstand floating on the sea intact. In the year 1004, a dream vision instructed a monk from the Iviron monastery to walk on water and retrieve an icon in the sea. This is a fresco depicting the discovery of the icon. So this is an 18th century fresco in Iviron, on Mount Athos, depicting the 11th century discovery of the icon, which is known as the Portaitissa. And this icon was, according to tradition, put into the water by a woman in Nicaea in Asia Minor to save it. So the floating or flying icon indicated the connection of far-flung localities to centers of Orthodox spirituality, such as Constantinople or Nicaea. These icon discovery stories and the icons themselves represented the cohesion of the Orthodox Christian community during Byzantium and into the ensuing Ottoman period, when authority radiated from the Patriarch of Constantinople. In the 17th and 18th centuries, one after another floating icon was found and enshrined on the Cycladic Islands, everything, including Andros, Amorgos, Ios, Sikinos, and Tinos as well had its own floating icons, fished out of the sea. On Naxos, so many icons have floated up that there's a special church that celebrates all the different waterborne icons. The point I want to make is this. The buried icons discovered on Tinos in 1823 and at Argo Kili in 1836 represented a thematic change. After the revolution broke out in 1821, the earlier theme of the floating icon, connecting the periphery to the Byzantine center, Constantinople, Asia Minor someplace, disappeared. And it disappeared to be replaced by dreams of buried icons. In the revolutionary period and immediately after, autochthony urgently required statement, and the Tinos and Naxos discoveries offered prototypes of a new genre. Digging became a spiritual enterprise which enacted a new vision of proprietorship comparable to the activities of the renegade Protestant diggers or true levelers of the English Revolution. These English diggers performatively leveled out iniquitous social hierarchy when they dug on St. George's Hill in Surrey. Whereas under the Ottomans, the vast majority of Orthodox Christians were landless peasants working on estates. In the 1830s, they were transitioning into potential owners of the land. In 1835, the state passed the law for the dotation of Greek families that allowed all native-born Greeks to receive up to 2,000 drachmas of national property. Social and historical circumstances disposed people to think of their land and its past with a new intensity. Dreams of buried icons allowed these ideas of autochthony and ownership to develop. Abduction operated in this social context to propel thought in the direction of the past. A buried icon indexed the historical inhabitation of the place and connected people to local predecessors, not necessarily their biological progenitors, but predecessors. Its discovery involved dedicated excavation, which resembled archaeological practice. Indeed, in this period, in 1820s, 1830s, it may have mimicked the prestigious national discipline that emerged during the same period. The buried icon tradition involved uncovering ancestral connections, but the history being celebrated was Christian, not glorious antiquity, which the state sought to connect to with as little mediation as possible. And you remember in this period that Christian churches were cleared out of the Parthenon and out of the Thesion, so that there was immediate connection to the ancient Greeks. The relationship with official archaeology was fraught for a number of other reasons that I'll consider in a moment. By the end of the 19th century, traditions of long-buried icons had become standard in communities throughout Greece. After mentioning the discovery of the famous icon of Tinos, the folklorist Lawson went on to comment, and I'll read his quote in a second, but Lawson was an English folklorist who spent time traveling in Greece and collecting his data at the very end of the 19th century. And he published the book I'm going to quote from in 1910. So this is a kind of pulse reading 60, 70 years after the events that I've started talking about. So to quote Lawson, and this is no solitary example. The number of icons exhumed in obedience to dreams is immense. Wherever the traveler goes in Greece, he is wearied with the same reiterated story. During my stay in Greece, a village schoolmaster embarrassed the education office by applying for a week's holiday in order to direct a party of his fellow villagers in digging up an icon of which he had dreamt, and to build a chapel for it on the spot. It was felt that a body concerned with religious as well as secular instruction ought not to commit the impiety of refusing such a request, but it was feared that other schoolmasters would be encouraged to dream. Although cynical, the latter part of this quote points to the conflict between religious motivations and, quote, enlightened secular logic. Should digging up the past be approached as a spiritual activity, following saintly commands, and dependent on divine benevolence, as Bishop Gabriel Antinos had said when they were digging for the Tinos icon and they didn't find it for a long period of time? A plague, the plague, Panolis, hit Tinos. And Bishop Gabriel wrote a public letter to the whole community, and he said, the reason why we're being tormented by plague and not finding this icon is because you're not submitting to God piously in your digging. Some of you are out there with antique hunting and looting kinds of sentiments in mind, and the only way we're going to find the icon is by pure submission and revelation within the idiom of Christianity. So should icons be found that way? Should buried objects be found that way? Or should the search form part of a scientific exploration of the past, guided by principles of objectivity and analysis? In the practice of history or archaeology, the researcher is consciously trying to find out more about the past. Practitioners have singled out the past as an object of study. Intention and agency flow in that direction. You decide that you're interested in a period in the past, you do a survey, all sorts of intentional actions are performed, and the flow of action is from subject to object, from the intention of the researcher to finding these objects. An archaeologist, even the most rank amateur, even a looter, starts with a contextual historical idea of what might be found and where it might plausibly be found. Instead of coming at an object with the surrounding historical narrative, the Tinos and Naxos dreamers began to spin narratives around icons from the moment they envisioned them. As I said before, the icon came and selected them. The material object picked them. It's actually the opposite of the sort of research method I was outlining a moment ago. The Panagia who appeared in the visions of the Naxios shepherds in the 1830s was understood to be an emanation from the icon in the ground. The object was speaking, demanding its own discovery. On Tinos, people similarly followed holy commands delivered in dreams. According to Bishop Gabriel's letter, that is the way things should have remained. Secular history and worse, antique hunting pollute the enterprise. On Naxos, people dug on a remote hillside, not previously associated with any settlement or building. Their initial assertion that they would find icons possessed by early Christians from Egypt may have seemed fantastical to many outside observers. Certainly Argokili is a remote and isolated spot today. It's totally remote, and even as you saw, Christodoulos was perplexed at how an icon could be in such a remote, inhospitable spot, solid rock. In the 1830s, however, people lived in the hamlet of, in the 1830s when the icon was found, people still lived in this hamlet called Atsipapi, located less than 2 kilometers from Argokili. So we're talking about only 15-20 minutes walk away. In this village, this hamlet, now uninhabited, had grown up upon a prior Byzantine settlement dating from the 9th century, and Byzantine house structures are still evident there. A few kilometers further south stands the church of Panagia Kera, which also had a surrounding Byzantine settlement dating back to the same period. A little further south still lies the church of Agia Kyriaki, also dating to the iconoclast period, and containing rare aniconic designs and depictions of birds that reveal possible Islamic influences. Naxos surpasses all other islands, with the possible exception of Crete, for the plethora of its Byzantine churches, particularly those which, like Agia Kyriaki, contain aniconic paintings executed before, during, and immediately after the period of iconoclasm. In the 1830s, art historians had not begun to catalogue or analyze Byzantine art, and it's not probable that illiterate shepherds had been primed with any detailed historical knowledge. They did, however, have their own living Orthodox tradition, with its succession of weekly church services telling the story of Christ and the persecution of early Christians. The struggle over icons forms the subject of the first Sunday service of Lent, known as the Sunday of Orthodoxy, which we've just had. Must have been recently, a few Sundays ago. Local people in the 1830s could see that earlier Christians had built churches in their vicinity, and they could make assertions about buried icons that were more informed than they appear at first glance. Once they formed an initial abductive icon, which we can now see had a logical basis, a different type of thinking took over, and imagining that extended the initial hypothesis. Their thinking shifted in the direction of what Collingwood has termed historical imagination, which works in the realm of the plausible, not capriciously as fancy. As the distant past is not present to perception or available to personal memory, it must necessarily be imagined. But this is done according to assumptions constrained by intuition and a priori reasoning, just as we routinely imagine the flip side of a coin or the inside of a cracked egg. Collingwood's examples. The Naxio dreamers and the average historian, for a stretch here, come to occupy similar positions insofar as they both began to make inferences about the past. The icons and bones were ore, raw past, given over for historical processing by emplotment. The Naxio dreamers, however, came only partially into line with standard historical practice. Both the Naxiotes and historians proper, academic historians, both began from abductive hypotheses and move on to employ historical imagination, but then their trajectories radically diverge. The villagers did not engage in further historical research into the persecution of early Christians, or into iconoclasm on Naxos, or the study of other places in the region, in order to support their hypothesis. For the dreamers, the historicity of the icons was subordinate to their sanctity, and, like the authenticity of the icons themselves, already a matter of conviction, not one for empirical investigation. Contemporary historians would regard the story of the Egyptians as little more than a speculation, which has not undergone proper investigation. At the time of the initial discoveries, Enlightenment canons of proof and reasoning were being put into practice by the Bavarian-led state. In the context of independent Greece, with its national church now subordinate to the king, officials viewed the objects discovered at Argokili as detritus, rather than holy icons. The Naxos police chief and an inspector sent by the Holy Synod examined the icons found at Argokili in 1836, and both said that they were just rotten bits of wood with no semblance of any image on them. That's quoted in the archival documents that I've read. In fact, I brought it just because I thought you might not believe me. This is the report of the Naxos police chief examining the icons before they confiscated them and locked them away. Quote, "The icon, which in reality does not have the least appearance of an icon, is actually an oblong rectangle of utterly rotted wood. In size it measures," and he gives the dimensions, "upon which the faces of the All-Holy Mother of God and that of Christ are just barely depicted." And the other similarly says it's just rotten wood. State antipathy to the discovered objects arose, at least in part, from the fact that the new Greek state had outlawed the excavation of antiquities without authorization. The Oniric digging on Naxos broke the law. These new laws stood upon the foundation of a new systematic rationality that informed a different orientation to the world. At this moment, modern historical practice had just received important elaboration in the Berlin seminars of Leopold von Ranke, beginning in the mid-1820s. Under Bavarian rule, Rankean historicism rapidly diffused into the disciplines of history and archaeology as those emerged in Greece. The Bavarian regent Maurer showed familiarity with historiographical trends in Prussia. He even invited Ranke's protege, Zinkeisen, to take up the first chair in ancient history at Athens University, an offer, by the way, that Zinkeisen declined. Perhaps not enough euros in the pay pack for Zinkeisen. Ludwig Ross, born 1806 in Schleswig-Holstein, became Ephor for General Antiquities in 1833, and the first professor of classical archaeology at Athens University in 1837. The principles of historicism included the Cartesian distinction between fantasy and reality, and subject and object. The historical researcher, indeed the scientist, has to stand apart from the object of study, in this case, stand apart from past events, and then tried to understand them on the basis of evidence, that is, sources of various types. Historical time came to be conceived as linear and progressive, which entailed a view of the past as definitively separated from the present, consistent with its opposition to grand philosophies or theologies that claim to identify set patterns in history, a sort of Hegelian approach. Historicism departed from Hegel and stood fundamentally also opposed to Christianity-infused indigenous historicization of the sort proposed at Argo Keeling. The Naxiotes focused on returning the past to the present in a cyclical logic, where the recovery of lost possessions restored divine grace and made it present. The icon discoveries all dated to saints' days, notably the Annunciation, and the finds were made in company of priests after the performance of repeated prayer services. The engine of history in the local Romaic view was divine will, not human-derived progress. According to professional Rankean tenets, the past could be understood through meticulous research, but historians had to be careful not to commit the sin of anachronism. They needed to hold their contemporary values and logical assumptions apart and not impute them as operating assumptions of past people. As Ranke put it, quote, "There is not alive within us an interest similar to that of the past," end quote. Too close an identification with past actors also first of all, imagining that you could think like they did was a problem, but too close an identification also collapsed the subject-object distinction. Past protagonists could be addressed via objective source materials such as documents and artifacts, and the imagination of the historian could work artfully to portray these actors' motivations and context. The past could not, however, legitimately speak to or through the historian by means of subjective revelations in dreams or in states of ecstasy. Producing an unattested quotation of a past personage, one that was received in a dream, for example, violated the boundary between history and fiction. Past thought could not be reenacted. If it could, Collingwood wrote, time itself would be cancelled and the historian would be the person about whom he thinks, living over again in all respects the same, end quote. By speaking with the voice of the saints, or dialoguing with figures from the past, the Naxio dreamers violated the historian's injunction that the past be treated as an object of thought. And I have much further detail on this in my larger study. of a man on Naxos later in the 1930s who had extensive dreams where he met these Egyptians, talked with them, describes their clothing, and they give very long accounts of what happened to them in the distant past when they were covered and along with their icons in the earth. Historical imagination optimally should work meta-imaginatively. That is, in full conscious awareness that one is imagining the past, to be aware of your process of imagining. It's a mode of present experience sub specie praeteritorum, under the aspect of the past, as Oakeshott phrased it. In the early 19th century, professional historians came to view the re-experiencing and reanimating of the past in trance or dreams as illegitimate, and these principles have remained enshrined within the discipline of history ever since. In the 1830s Naxos, modern historical principles of research and epistemology collided with local Christian Romaic modes of historicization. For the discipline of history, the stories of the Egyptians would be sectioned off as myth or sacred history, to indicate that the stories were not based on acceptable evidence, or that they were held on the basis of faith, which prevented proper investigation. These local accounts did, nonetheless, function at the local level as credible accounts of the past, and I treat them personally as histories. Opposition to anachronism made historicism fundamentally consistent with the projects of rational governance and progress. Anachronism did not just mean keeping the present out of the past in historical representations, but also eliminating outmoded bits of the past from the present in the name of progress. Commenting on the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, Adamantios Korais, one of the leading ideologues of Hellenism, wrote that changing times make political change necessary, and a nation must not hold, quote, superstitiously to its political system just because it inherited it from the forefathers. Whoever acts thus, Korais said, resembles someone forced to wear baby clothes in adulthood, just because those are what his parents dressed him in, end quote. Not only is this ridiculous, Korais maintained, it leads to worse problems later. In the case at hand here, indigenous forms of historicization and archaeology were themselves identified as retrograde practices to be jettisoned in the name of rational development. Bavarian-mediated ideas of government and rational knowledge delegitimized local haptic modes of historicizing in areas like Mountain Naxos. Dreams or visions revealing information, the smell of bones, or the warm feel of the earth could not be accepted as methodology or as reliable evidence. When the icons were initially found and the bones were found, people did say the earth was warm and smelled good, and that was an indication that the people whose remains they were saintly. The temporal assumptions of science, with its physical mechanics, squelched popular Orthodox Christian apocalypticism. The state suppression of the cult of the Panagia Argokiliotissa in the 1830s exemplified this brute relationship between the imported historicist paradigm embraced by the Hellenic state and local Romaic relationships to the past, which fused ideas about the present and the future. From this point onward, the tide turned in the direction of the Hellenic, but Romaic suppositions about among the populace were not completely washed away. So then, to summarize and to conclude, over the longue durée, beginning in antiquity, the Orthodox Christian Greek-speaking population had developed a Romaic mode of being governed by a redemptive Christian orientation to time. Meanwhile, a Hellenic mode of being, they developed a Romaic mode of being which was governed by redemptive Christian orientation. Meanwhile, a Hellenic mode of being, based on a different orientation toward time, developed in Northern Europe from the Renaissance through the Enlightenment. Hellenism embraced the post-Enlightenment attitude of historicism that gave rise to a modern being, grounded in a sense of time as linear, progressive, and fundamentally unpredictable. It carried no assured answers in terms of divine plans or other overarching patterns that could give intrinsic meaning to events. The benefits of progress and betterment ideally compensated for the terrifying randomness of events that this view unleashed. This is the subject which Mircea Eliade explains, I think, very well in his book, Myth of the Eternal Return. That is this idea that history, modern historicist history, is terrifying because you don't know what can happen, it's random, and that is much less comfortable than a history that's teleological according to a plan. At independence, this Hellenism, now polished by diaspora Greeks such as Korais and embraced by European Philhellenes and politicians, entered Greece. These two different temporally defined modes of being began to cohabit in the Greek state from 1832 onwards. At first they clashed, as when the state attempted to close down the cult of the Panagia Argokiliotissa in 1838. Ultimately, they have merged into a new Helleno-Christian synthesis, which fused the two possibilities, but left an unstable temporality among the population, one that fluctuates between the linear and the cyclical, between rational progressivism and spiritual redemption. Yanis Hamilakis and Eliana Yalouri have well documented the development of a professional Greek archaeology that manages to sacralize the objects it finds and treat them like Christian relics. The leading archaeologist Manolis Andronikos, for example, not only listened sympathetically to dreams, but he carefully orchestrated the discovery of the tomb of Philip II to fall on the day of the archangels, Gabriel and Michael, guardians of the underworld. This exemplifies the poetics of indigenous Hellenism. Thank you.